Are you aware that Kenya was at one point at par with the countries dubbed the Asian Tigers? That's way back in the 60s and the 70s. Decades later, countries like Singapore and Malaysia have grown economically, surpassing what even the forefathers envisioned for their countries, leaving Kenya stagnated despite gaining independence before them. Our reporter Abdiaziz draws parallels between Kenya and Singapore in his attempt to answer the question of where did we veer off?
The great place we keep talking about, Singapore, they were with us, they were we were all in 1960, we were the same level. Today, Singapore is in the first world. Singapore was a slum like Kibera. All of you know that. You've seen the pictures. Singapore was like Kibera. But they made some difficult decisions. And that is why they are where they are, and we are where we are.
In the 21st century, you might have heard these remarks from leaders, economists and dignitaries alike comparing Kenya to countries like Singapore and Malaysia. Nations that have grown their economy and standing tall among the League of Nations. However, this was not the case 60 years ago, where the Asian Tigers were at par with a third world country, Kenya. Despite the statement sounding a little bit far-fetched owing to the current status of the two countries that are worlds apart on gross domestic product, infrastructure and governance, analysts argue that there are some pertinent macroeconomic fundamentals that affirms this.
To some extent, but not necessarily true. There were different colonies, different experiences. There was more mental underdevelopment in Kenya than there was in those places. Just given their environment. So there are some things one can say they are similar, but there are also some differences. And of course, what kind of leadership did they have?
Kenya gained its independence in 1963, while Singapore became a sovereign state in 1965. But the question that lingers is why Singapore has been able to develop at a very fast pace while Kenya hasn't.
You see, lenders has two types. There is what are called transactional lenders, and there is what is called transformational lenders. Transformational lenders establish policies which outlive them because they are concerned with the next generation. Transactional lenders have policies which benefit them while in office, and they are concerned with the next election. So the Asians, the countries we have mentioned, Malaysia, Singapore, they are the leaders whose focus was to develop their people.
I think they were collectively more clear as to what they wanted to do and the obstacles they needed to deal with. And with that clarity, then it's possible to move forward. Kenya started grappling with its future around the time of independence. There was a lot of talk, and it was just talk, about socialism without really understanding what socialism was. And we have that session of paper number 10 of 1965, which was an attempt to define the objectives.
Pundits argue that poverty, illiteracy, health challenges, the style of leadership from the founding fathers, and now the endemic corruption have all contributed to the gap between the two countries.
The question is not so much the different GDPs, but different trajectories of growth, the ideologies, the expectations. What did people want?
For instance, in 1966, Singapore's GDP was at $1.096 billion, less than Kenya's $1.165 billion. In 1978, when Kenya's founding president Mzee Jomo Kenyatta passed away, Kenya's GDP had risen to $5.3 billion, but Singapore GDP had grown more immensely to $8.06 billion, surpassing that of Kenya. By 1990, when Kwan Yew stepped down as the Prime Minister and Kenya was on the verge of multi-party democracy, Singapore's GDP was at $38.9 billion compared to Kenya's $8.57 billion. Moreover, in 2013, when President Uhuru Kenyatta was taking over the reins of Kenya's leadership, he was managing an economy of only $55.24 billion, while his counterpart in Singapore at the time was managing a whopping $297.9 billion economy.
In Singapore and Malaysia, they do have islands here and there, but they did not have serious divisiveness of the country. When they came up, Kenya had very serious divisive issues that needed to be taken care of, and they may not have been taken care of as well as they should have.
With the growth of the economy of both nations apart, the founding President Mzee Jomo Kenyatta during his tenure assured Kenyans that his administration will tackle corruption that proved to be a major stumbling block in implementing policies that would have seen the country grow immensely.
And once corruption thrives, economic growth is stagnated. You see, economic growth is pegged on 4 levels only. Food, you don't allow corruption into food sector. You don't allow corruption into education sector. You don't allow corruption into health sector. And then you remove corruption also in government policy making.
And corruption is endemic. And the act of corruption is an act of underdevelopment. So those who engage in this gross misbehavior were not developing the country. They were instead underdeveloping it.
Singapore, on the other hand, has been ranked as one of the least corrupt nations across the globe, alongside Denmark and New Zealand. In Kenya, corruption has seen massive loss of public funds that could have been channeled to propel the economy to match the growth of other middle-income economies across the globe. In 2018, Kenya ranked 143 out of 180 in the World Corruption Index.
Because Tanzania started well, it improved a solid social structure which removes greed. Because greed brings corruption. So their structure does not tolerate greed, even when it comes, like it did under Kikwete. The Magufuli was able to come and take people back to the route, to the proper path.
Despite the glaring differences, the two nations continue to grapple with the high income inequalities. Singapore's 10% of the population commands 45.8% in 2017. In Kenya, 10% of the population commands about 40% of the national income. According to UNICEF, 42% of Kenyan population lives below the poverty line. Economists opine that boosting investment in the manufacturing sector and supporting new innovations will greatly propel Kenya's economic growth and change the country's fortune in years to come. Abdiaziz Hashim for KBC Channel 1.